Hi everyone, this video is going to be a little bit of an explanation for the final research paper. In the final research paper, you are asked to choose a specific cultural identity, race, gender, ethnicity, etc., and examine that group's cultural memory. Analyze how that group's identity has been constructed through its location and a historical narrative, and show how that historical understanding has been transmitted through one specific literary text. You may consider either how that group has constructed its own identity or how other groups have constructed an identity for it, but you'll only have room to do one. You can use pop culture sources such as films or other texts, though it does seem to be easiest to use text assigned in this class. There are scholarly sources in the class itself. So notice down here, your paper has to be 5 to 7 pages in length with double space, normal margins, 12-point font, and that you have to use 3 scholarly sources other than the textbook. So scholarly sources are academically published articles and academically published books. You can find those in the library or on Google Scholar, for example, but you should not use general websites, anything that's a .com, website. Don't use SparkNotes or anything like that. Those are not academic sources. So you need to find articles related to it. Now notice that there are articles in the class under the required and recommended resources related to these things. Okay, so steps to complete the assignment. You need to review the concepts of cultural memory and cultural identity from weeks 3 and weeks 4. Be very specific about the identity you're choosing. So here are some examples. Explore that group's cultural memory and cultural identity through one literary text. So, and you can choose that text. And then down here, here's a guiding question. Has the group constructed its own cultural identity, or have others constructed an identity for it? For example, Edward Said's Orientalism illustrates how others have constructed a cultural identity for the people of the Middle East that is in stark contrast to their own cultural identity. Choose one or the other, but not both. Cite everything using APA. Remember that when you use quotes, you do need to include the author's name, the year it was published, and the page number too. So, and you shouldn't be using things that don't have page numbers. That's another good rule to live by in the realm of academic evidence. Okay, so cultural memory, cultural identity. So remember the cultural memory discussion that we had. And we read articles related to that. You completed a paper on that. And also in week 5 of this course, you are going to be in the discussion explaining what you're going to do. So choose an identity that has meaning for you. Preferably one that you're familiar with at least a little bit. So for example, it would be hard for me to choose a Muslim identity because I don't know much about it. Of course, I can do research, but I haven't lived it. And even if I do research, I'm probably not going to be very objective, or I'd be objective, but I wouldn't like show the depth of knowledge, as opposed to if I chose a certain form of Christianity, Protestant Christianity, Catholicism, or something like that. So try to choose something that you're rather familiar with, and also that you're interested in. Make sure that you find the identity of interest, and then choose one text related to that. So, as an example, we read portions of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So were you to choose the cultural identity of African Americans in the United States, you could definitely use that one book to explain how it shaped a cultural identity and how it was shaped by the cultural memory and the cultural identity that already existed within the African American community at that time. Something else I was thinking about is a cultural identity of like the grunge culture. In the late 80s or 80s and 90s in the United States. A text related to that might be Nirvana's Nevermind album, or perhaps there are books, I'm sure there are books and articles written on grunge culture and how it formed and how it shapes society, right? So we know that grunge culture has shaped society, punk culture, and there's multiple types of punk music. So you might focus on a specific type. So you could focus on music. And you could even focus on smaller identificatory groups, Fortnite culture, and things like that. Just make sure that you're utilizing academic evidence and that you are referring back to one specific text. So, we read Night by Elie Wiesel, and if you were going to represent, Jewish culture during World War II, or attempt to talk about the cultural memory of that, then you would want to use that specific text since you already read it, and it's a firsthand account of of the horror that this person has been through. So yeah, you can either talk about how that group has created its own identity, or how external society has shaped the identity of that group. So, for example, going back to the slavery example, the way that that white people, both in the North and South, primarily, I guess, in the South, tried to shape the perspective and the cultural memory of African slaves and African Americans. They tried to say certain things about their capability, intellectual capabilities. They made comments about the morality and the way that they lived, detrimental comments that attempted to shape the view of these people in a very negative light, so that they could justify enslaving them and make all these claims about what they were doing. So that would be a way that an external group subjugated and attempted to create a cultural memory and identity for a group. Or you might take the other route and talk about how people internal to the slave movement, slaves and others who attempted to free them, created their own internal narrative about what slavery was like and about what the slaves were like, and about that, no, in fact, they did have the same intellectual capacities and they did have the same rights as free men and women living as citizens or at that point not citizens, but that they ought to be citizens of the United States, and that they should have freedom of liberty, life, liberty, and happiness just like everybody else has. So that would be like taking the internal people's perspective and trying to extrapolate it out. I have some other videos that I'll share with you, but I hope that helps you as you approach your final paper.